The spiritual dimensions of our planetary crisis. This is Jim Sloman speaking. There are three aspects to our journey here. First, it appears to me that our dear planet Earth is in crisis in various ways. One of those ways is climate change, of course, but only one. In my opinion, there are a number of different dimensions to the crisis. So first, let's take a look at those dimensions. Second, let's look at two historical societies that exploited their ecology beyond its limits and see what happened to them. One society did not succeed in recovering and destroyed itself. The other society did succeed in recovering and saved itself. Let's see what the difference was. And third, if humanity were to succeed in creating a sustainable planet, what spiritual and cultural principles might be involved in doing so. Let's begin our journey by looking at humanity's increasing alienation from the natural world. For millions of years, human beings lived in close contact with nature. The predominant ethos of hunter-gatherer societies is exemplified by many of the original Native American tribes, who felt that the natural world was not only alive with spirit, but in some ways, spirit itself. This was probably true of early humans in general. Then, anthropologists estimate, about 60,000 years ago, give or take, humans first acquired language. Not a language that any of us would recognize today, but a precursor to that. And acquiring language had consequences. To see what I mean, let me tell you about the neuroanatomist Jill Bolte Taylor's experience. At the age of 37, she sustained a stroke which completely deprived her for several years of the ability to use or understand language. As a result, she lost all of her memories and the ability to think about the past or the future. In other words, she was forced to live completely in the present without language. Later on, after she had recovered her language abilities, she recounted what that experience of no language had been like. The result, she said, was that she felt a peace that she had never experienced before. And above all, she recounted, she felt a connectedness to all things that she had never experienced before either. From this anecdote, we can glimpse that though humanity gained a great deal of power from the acquisition of language, we also lost something precious, that sense of oneness with all things. A further alienation from nature occurred during the agricultural revolution, which occurred about 10,000 years ago. As humanity began domesticating and farming crops, for the first time the radical idea of staying in one place took hold. This allowed for specialists for the first time, carpenters, laborers, kings, soldiers, priests, and of course that truly pitiful class, the storytellers. But at the same time, farmers and others felt an increasing separation from nature, for now one's crops and possessions could be threatened by pests, floods, droughts, and other natural disasters. Thus the notion appeared that one's crops, domesticated animals, and possessions were something that needed to be protected from the vagaries of nature. A further dualism had crept in. Another development was philosophy and religion. The philosopher Plato and the Neoplatonists that followed him posited an ideal world existing separately from this world. Compared to that world, they said, this world, which is subject to change and decay, was at best derivative and secondary. Later on, this notion was adopted in a different form by many religions, which posited an ideal world in the heavens somewhere, and that this world, degraded and sinful, was merely a transit point on the way to the ideal world. These widely held views represented a further alienation from the natural world. A fourth alienation from nature occurred during the scientific revolution, starting about 1600 AD. Theorists of this revolution, such as Francis Bacon, Galileo, and Descartes, became convinced that the best way to describe the natural world was to use numbers and the language of mathematics. In keeping with this, they emphasized that the primary qualities of the natural world were what could be measured: size, shape, weight, and so on. Other aspects of the natural world, including its great beauty, its life-affirming qualities, its organic cycles and transcendent mystery, were regarded as secondary qualities of lesser importance. With the greater power that came with this revolution also came a notion of power over the natural world. It was assumed now that humanity had both the ability and the right to exercise dominion over the physical world. While Bacon made a great contribution to the scientific method by emphasizing that hypotheses must consider empirical evidence, he also said that, quote, "Nature takes orders from man and works under his authority," end quote. Then came the publication of Newton's Principia in 1687. While a magnificent synthesis, it also conveyed the idea that the world was a kind of vast machine. Indeed, it was at about this time that the notion of the world as a form of giant mechanical clock came into being. The philosopher Descartes said explicitly that the thinking mind only was primary, and that matter and animal life, the physical world, were of secondary consequence. Then came the Industrial Revolution, where men, women, and children were, for the first time, organizing their life around work in factories. Workers now spent their time in artificial and very difficult conditions, surrounded by loud, clanking machines and synchronizing their movements to the rhythms of those machines. And later, with the rise of the consumer economy, all things, the bounties of nature, one's time, one's labor, all became viewed as commodities whose real value was expressed as units of money. And now, of course, it's commonplace to see people hunched over their devices, staring into screens, somewhat oblivious to the world around them. In all these developments, more and more power has been gained, yes, but also something was lost. So what is the result of that loss? We can partially glimpse what has been lost by looking at the ecological state of the world today. If we say that the world is in crisis, what does that mean? How is it showing up? To answer that, let's talk about carrying capacity. William Rees and colleagues, along with later researchers, asked a question: could the total impact of humanity on the environment be measured? And if so, could that be compared to the ecological carrying capacity of the entire planet? They added up the various sources that humanity relies upon: minerals, forests, fisheries, fossil fuels, underground aquifers, fertile soils, freshwater, biodiversity, etc., and the various sinks that humanity is relying upon to dump its wastes: the atmosphere, the oceans, landfills, and nature's extensive breakdown and recycling processes. They added up all of this reliance upon nature's resources and gave it a name: humanity's ecological footprint, measured in Earths, as in how many Earths are needed to support this ecological footprint. Here's what the latest findings show. Until 1970 or so, humanity's footprint was below 1.0. Then, in the early 1970s, humanity passed that mark and is now at 1.5. That is, humanity is consuming the resources of 1.5 Earths. Another way of saying this is that humanity has overshot the carrying capacity of the Earth by 50%. This is very significant because it represents an attempt to measure humanity's comprehensive overshoot upon the Earth's natural systems. The concept of overshoot can be understood from everyday life. Here's an example. Imagine that we have a sports car and that we drive the car fast enough so that its engine RPM gauge goes over the red line and stays there. Notice that nothing happens at first. Though we're pushing the engine beyond its limits, the engine keeps running for a while. However, an engine running beyond its red line is steadily and rapidly deteriorating. Beyond its red line, the engine is literally wearing itself out at a rapid rate. Yet we notice that the engine does keep running until it reaches a point where it suddenly seizes up, breaks down, and destroys itself. This is an excellent metaphor for where our planet is at the moment. In essence, humanity is running at a rate 50% above the planet's red line, and it's all still more or less working, like the car engine, but it won't do so forever. Beyond a certain point, the biosphere could suffer a gigantic breakdown. Notice, too, that this breakdown can come suddenly and massively. In other words, once a system has gone beyond its natural limits, it must somehow get back below those limits, or it will break down. Now let's look at some of the individual elements of this planetary overshoot. First, climate change. The 800-pound gorilla in the room is, of course, climate change. The pre-industrial level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 280 parts per million. The level now is over 400 parts per million and rising. This results primarily from the burning of fossil fuels, beginning with coal in the 1700s, then oil beginning in the late 1800s to power everything from cars and trucks to planes and industry, and then natural gas. Why does this matter? Basically because carbon in the atmosphere acts like a giant sponge, absorbing more heat from the sun. The effect has often been compared to a greenhouse, which absorbs and concentrates heat. Another contributor to global warming is methane. Methane is important because it is over 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and in its warming effect on the planet is second now only to carbon dioxide. Methane contains an incredible danger. Offshore of every continent, just under the seafloor, is a chemical called methane hydrate. This substance is frozen, but as the planet warms, it is beginning to unfreeze and release methane into the atmosphere. In addition, thousands of square miles of methane hydrate are buried in the permafrost of Siberia, which is also warming up and beginning to release methane into the atmosphere. The danger arises because this could become a self-reinforcing process. As methane is released into the atmosphere, it warms the planet, which results in melting more methane hydrate, which then releases more methane into the atmosphere, and so on in a feedback loop. A number of scientists are concerned that this could lead to what's known as a runaway feedback loop, where the process becomes unstoppable. Could this happen? It already did. This is basically what occurred on the planet Venus, which has a surface temperature now of 900 degrees Fahrenheit and is completely uninhabitable. Climate change doesn't just make things hotter. Sometimes people think, oh well, the winters will be a little warmer and the summers will be a little hotter. Big deal. But it's much more than that. For example, the photosynthesis that takes place in plants, upon which all food on Earth depends, begins slowing down when the temperature goes beyond 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And beyond 104 degrees Fahrenheit, photosynthesis just comes to a halt. Plants can survive for a few days without photosynthesis, but beyond that time they begin dying. Imagine how this would affect those plants upon which humanity especially depends, such as rice, corn, and wheat. And now keep in mind that summer days of 100 degrees or more, which used to be rare, have been steadily increasing. Climate change also means that weather becomes more unpredictable, more erratic, more violent. This occurs because the atmosphere is warmer, which means it is holding more energy. This extra energy in the atmosphere, in turn, adds more energy to such things as hurricanes, tornadoes, rainstorms, and snowstorms. Extra energy can also alter the jet stream, which paradoxically can sometimes make winters colder while summers are hotter, all while the overall temperature of the planet keeps increasing. Global warming is also resulting in the acidification of the oceans. Some of the increased carbon in the atmosphere dissolves in the world's oceans and becomes carbonic acid. Why does this matter? Because calcifying species, such as certain phytoplanktons and zooplanktons, which are at the base of the ocean's food chain, cannot form or keep adequate shells in water that becomes too acidic. This increasing acidity also means that many coral reefs worldwide are bleaching, as the process is called, becoming dead and lifeless. Another follow-on effect of global warming is the melting of glaciers in Greenland, Antarctica, and elsewhere, causing a rise in sea level, a story in itself, and the melting of ice caps. For example, part of the intense drought in California, now affecting most of that state, is related to the greatly decreased runoff from the ice caps on the Sierra Nevada mountains. But here's an interesting tidbit about global warming. Even if global warming were disproved tomorrow, which would make climate change deniers and obfuscators happy, in fact, the planet would still be in a deep crisis. Here are some examples. Depletion of fresh water. Humans are withdrawing 620 cubic miles of fresh water each year from the planet's rivers, lakes, and aquifers. Because of this overwhelming withdrawal, many sources of fresh water are drying up. For example, the Colorado River, from which 7 southwestern U.S. states draw water, has dried up to such an extent that it no longer reaches the sea. The gigantic Ogallala Aquifer, which underlies the Great Plains states in the U.S., is rapidly diminishing. This undermines the ability of the Great Plains, which has been called the breadbasket of the world, to grow crops. If this enormous aquifer were to run dry, it would severely impact the ability to grow food in the Great Plains. And if that were to happen, it's estimated that it would take 6,000 years for nature to replenish this aquifer. Similarly, desertification is spreading. 1/3 of the land surface of Earth is now desert, and deserts are increasing. For example, desert is spreading in northwestern China. Underneath that area is a huge aquifer, and researchers are warning that it is drying up. China has 20% of the world's population, but only 6% of its fresh water. Because of this, China draws heavily on underground water, which has been dropping on average about a yard per year for the last 40 years. In some areas it is completely dry now. Thus, to access fresh water, farmers and others are having to dig wells hundreds of feet deep. Water is scarce in 2/3 of China's cities now, and this is just one country. Many other countries are similarly affected. Two strong contributors to spreading desertification are climate change, which we've already talked about, and deforestation, which exposes the soil to losses from rain and wind. In turn, the greatest sources of deforestation are clearing land for agriculture. Indonesia and the Amazon rainforests have been prime examples. clearing land to accommodate the growth of cities, intensive logging for timber, and not least, more severe forest fires. Of Earth's original old-growth forests, only 22% now remain, and over 50% of this loss of forest has occurred just since 1950. Species loss and loss of biodiversity. There have been 5 great extinctions of life in the last 500 million years, where up to 90% of all life on Earth was extinguished. Scientists are now calling our own time the 6th Great Extinction because so many species are dying. For example, the wild tiger population of the Earth has been reduced by 97% in the last 100 years. There are now only 3,000 wild tigers left on the planet. 3,000. Biologists say that wild tigers, the largest cat species on Earth and the very definition of wildness, are in danger of going extinct within a generation. Witnesses in the 19th century described flocks of passenger pigeons so vast that they completely darkened the sky for hours at a time. One flock was described as being 300 miles long and containing 3 billion birds. Extensive hunting caused the passenger pigeon to go extinct. Hunting was so easy that it was said you could just point a shotgun at random in the sky and birds would fall to the ground in hordes. But nothing is infinite. The world's last passenger pigeon, named Martha, died in 1914. As another example, the Atlantic population of gray whales went extinct in the 18th century from intensive hunting, and many other species of whales are endangered. The population of many species of large ocean fish have declined by 90% or more. The vast populations of codfish off the east coast of Canada collapsed several decades ago from overfishing and have yet to recover. The populations of amphibians all over the world are crashing as well. Many, many other examples could be given. And of course, the human predation upon species in the 20th and 21st centuries has been far worse than in previous centuries. It can be hard to believe, but according to the latest studies, the population of Earth's wildlife has dropped by 52% just since 1970. In fact, the rate of species extinction on Earth is now described by scientists as being 100 to 1,000 times greater than the historic background rate. Well, so what? Who cares if a frog species dies over here, or a plant species over there, or the last tigers will be found only in zoos? But researchers now know that as an ecosystem loses its diversity, it becomes more fragile and less resilient. In other words, we lower the biodiversity of the planet at our own peril. Metallic resources on the Earth are also getting more scarce. For example, indium and some other rare earth metals are estimated to be exhausted by 2028. Silver reserves are estimated to be exhausted by 2029, gold reserves by 2030, copper reserves by 2044, and so on. The world's economy is heavily dependent on these resources, which are found in everything from autos to generators to computers and smartphones. These are just some examples of the multiple dimensions of Earth's ecological crisis. Now, let's look at 2 historical societies that faced ecological catastrophe and what happened to them. We'll look at one society that collapsed and another that saved itself, and we'll see what lessons can be learned. These 2 examples are adapted from the brilliant book Collapse by Jared Diamond, as supplemented from other sources. Easter Island. The story of Easter Island is a tale about the most isolated inhabitable island on Earth. Easter Island is all by itself way out in the vast reaches of the Pacific Ocean. Its nearest neighbors are Pitcairn Island, about 1,300 miles west, and Chile, about 2,200 miles east. The Easter Islanders existed alone. That's quite significant because it means that if the islanders got into trouble, they had nowhere else to go and no nearby neighbors to call upon. The metaphor becomes vivid when we look at the situation of planet Earth. Earth exists amidst the vastness of deep space. If there are other planets out there like ours, that is, with intelligent life, they're inconceivably remote from us, revolving around far distant suns. In other words, planet Earth exists way out in its own ocean, like Easter Island, and cannot call upon other planets with intelligent life forms if it gets into trouble. Thus the story of Easter Island, the saga of a society isolated out in space, so to speak, shows what can happen. Without really meaning to, the Easter Islanders gradually destroyed their environment, and in doing so, destroyed themselves. Sometimes it's thought that we humans are just too important, that the universe would not allow us to extinguish ourselves. But there was no cavalry that came charging over the hill to save the Easter Islanders. The universe let it happen. And if we humans extinguish ourselves, there may be no cavalry coming over the hill to save us either. It's up to us. According to archaeologists, Easter Island was settled between 1000 and 1200 AD by Eastern Polynesians. From the beginning, the island was so remote that there was no connection with another island. No trade, no immigration, no colonization, nothing. The island was alone in space, like our Earth. Easter Island is famous for the great stone statues on it called moai. The islanders built about 1,000 of them, weighing 10 to 90 tons each, and erected them all over the island. These moai represented high-level ancestors to which the islanders prayed. When these Easter Island settlers arrived on the scene, the island was covered by dense forests, including 21 different kinds of trees. The trees provided many services. First of all, they provided lumber for houses and other structures. They provided palm fronds to make roofs, baskets, and thatched walls. The trunks of certain trees could be made into large seagoing canoes, powered by sails constructed of palm fronds. With these seagoing canoes, and harpoons also made from trees, the islanders were able to hunt a rich variety of seafood. They also feasted on an assortment of land birds, seabirds, and shellfish. In addition, the trees provided bananas and palm nuts. Further, by clearing forest in certain areas, the settlers were able to grow crops in gardens, farms, and plantations. So the Easter Islanders also had vegetables, particularly yams, sweet potatoes, and taro, as staples in their diet. They had an abundance of food. And not least, the trees also provided firewood for heat, light, and cooking. Yes, the settlers of Easter Island found their forests to be extremely useful. In this fashion, after several hundred years of existence, the Easter Islanders reached a peak of population, abundance, and ecological impact around 1600 AD, with a total population of about 15,000 people and a thriving, but unsustainable, economy. By 1600, deforestation was proceeding rapidly on the island. The booming economy was being powered by cutting trees at a rate higher than the trees could regenerate. In modern terms, we would say that the islanders, to support the high level of their economy, were exploiting the ecology of their island at a rate above its carrying capacity. In other words, the islanders had entered into a phase of overshoot. As Jared Diamond points out, the person who cut the last tree on Easter Island probably thought nothing of it. After all, the clearing of trees had proceeded gradually over generations, so that only real old-timers could remember when there were forests on the island. Now farmland was everywhere to support the high population. But as the Easter Islanders lost their trees, they lost the bananas and nuts that the trees had provided. With the loss of the trees, the islanders also lost the ability to build harpoons and seagoing canoes, so they lost most of the seafood in their diet. The land birds, from unsustainable rates of hunting, went extinct. Seabirds were reduced to a remnant population. Thus the islanders lost most of their sources of wild food. Meanwhile, their agricultural food supply was also being affected by the deforestation. As the forest disappeared, the soil of the island began to erode. Unprotected by trees, the soil blew away as dust and washed away in rain gullies. As the soil increasingly blew away or washed away, the food supply began declining. Near simultaneous with this development, the economy of the island also began to decline. As fewer and fewer trees remained, the rate of harvested trees declined, and along with it, the economy, since the economy was dependent upon exploiting the ecology of the island at an unsustainable rate. As economic activity lessened, the Easter Islanders became poor. Activity of all kinds decreased. As their soils declined in quality and washed away or blew away, the islanders began to starve. And as that happened, the population also began to decline. This was a gradual process at first, like a train leaving a station. Then the decline in population gathered momentum, and finally, as food became more scarce and economic activity collapsed, the islanders slipped from a highly organized society into chaos and civil war. When the Easter Islanders began to grasp that they were in an ecological catastrophe, at first they built larger statues with which to make more urgent appeals to the ancestors. But then, as the island slipped into war and finally anarchy, the building of large statues was abandoned. Finally, in desperation, the islanders turned to the last source of food available to them, cannibalism. Even that didn't work because it's self-limiting, and the population collapsed over 80% to a small remnant of people who turned to living in caves for protection. This was the state of affairs when the British explorer Captain Cook visited Easter Island in 1774. He described the remaining inhabitants as, quote, small, lean, timid, and miserable, end quote. And that was the end of the once thriving Easter Island civilization. In technical terms, it had gone into what scientists call overshoot, followed by collapse. Now let's take a look at a civilization that also went into ecological overshoot, but managed to save itself. This was medieval Japan, also known as Tokugawa Japan, named for the ruling shoguns. What follows is my own personal interpretation of the story, based on research from various sources. Immigrants to Japan came over from Korea and China beginning in the 3rd century BC, and vast forests were everywhere. The new inhabitants, of course, set about clearing areas of forest for farming, housing, and firewood. As time went on, clearing of forests continued, but the forests were still so huge that nobody gave it much thought. Then, around 1600 AD, with the advent of the Tokugawa shogunate, the country found itself in a period of unusual prosperity. During the century from 1600 to roughly 1700, the country accelerated upward in both population and economic activity. To support this wave of prosperity, more trees were cut than ever. So many that sometime around 1650 the society went into overshoot, and by 1700 it was in critical overshoot because its prosperous economy was dependent upon an ecology that was rapidly dying. In fact, according to archaeologists, by 1710 the main areas of Japan, except for a few remote places, had been deforested. And because of that, the soil and its nutrients had been eroding more and more. Sure enough, by the late 1600s, a series of famines were occurring across the land. But then a remarkable thing happened. Everybody kind of woke up about what was happening, led by far-sighted political leadership. The wake-up had begun back in the 1660s, when the ruling shogun had warned of the dangers of erosion caused by deforestation. Though efforts at forest management began around 1670, at first they were small and localized. Yet under the shogun Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, ruling from 1680 to 1709, these efforts accelerated. Then under the reformist shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune, ruling from 1716 to 1745, the national effort to save the forests of Japan really took off. The effort was spearheaded by returning to the country's mythic roots in Confucianism, stressing social harmony and a benevolent approach to nature. To achieve such harmony, the reformist shoguns comprehended would require nothing less than a sustainable society, sustainable in all three areas of ecology, population, and economic activity. Note that the centerpiece of this effort was a form of spiritual and cultural revival. Because the gravity of the developing crisis was recognized, everything possible was done. First, a series of stopgap measures were taken in order to drastically slow the cutting of trees. They included banning the practice of clearing forests, closing off certain forested lands to permit their regeneration, and tightly regulating who could log on the land. Measures also extended to living styles such as incentives for lighter house construction, building styles that could take advantage of warming by the sun, encouraging cooking stoves and portable heaters instead of large fireplaces, and so on. The effort was sophisticated, and these initial measures bought some time. Next came longer-term measures to encourage the regrowth of forests. There was an outpouring of studies and books about silviculture, that is, the practice of growing and maintaining forests. Gradually, Tokugawa-era Japan began to implement the concept of plantation forestry, where forests are perceived as a slow-growing crop. This was also helped by a lifting in 1720 of the restriction on Western books, which opened the society to new ideas. As Japanese society came to embrace the vital importance of plantation forests to their lifestyle and economy, such forests sprang up everywhere and became commonplace in the period after 1750. And by 1800, to its great benefit, Japan had ended its long decline in timber and had essentially succeeded in stabilizing the relationship with its forests. But that wasn't all. The shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune and his successors emphasized as well that the population would have to stabilize. They were wise enough to understand that to reach a truly stable society, it was not enough to stabilize the forests. The society must also reach a stable state in population, they realized, so that the pressure on the ecosystem could decline and remain below the ecosystem's carrying capacity. Consequently, a number of practical measures were implemented. Couples were encouraged to marry later, mothers were encouraged to nurse for longer periods, thus spacing out pregnancies, and contraceptives were made widely available. Underlying these measures was the renewal of Confucianism, encouraged by the shoguns, which emphasized stability, balance, and harmony. The whole society came to understand the desirability of bringing the population to a state of equilibrium. And remarkably, in the century from 1721 to 1828, the population of Japan remained stable at 27 million people. The third pillar in Japan's recovery from the brink of disaster was the stabilization of its economy. This was primarily accomplished through a society-wide introspection about the Confucian ideals of moderation and prudence in all things. Excessive consumption was discouraged and seen as not leading to happiness. Reserves were put aside to protect the country against disaster. The society stabilized and preserved itself. The adoption of a new spiritual and cultural awareness was central to this process, in my opinion. This effort was so successful that even today, 80% of Japan's land area is covered by forests. However, before we rhapsodize too much about Japan's ecological virtues, we should note in passing that among other things, Japan has been absolutely rapacious in the hunting of whales, a practice that continues even today. Now, before we look at the general spiritual and cultural principles which might underlie a sustainable human world, let's take a look at two myths which are often proposed as easy or even inevitable solutions to the planet's crises. The first myth is technology. Particularly in business and economic circles, it's often posited that technology will solve whatever problems might be facing humanity. It's supposed to work something like this. As some resource gets more rare, its price will go up. This higher price will cause more money and therefore more research and technology to be thrown at the problem, which will solve it. Voila, problem solved. But let's look at a modern situation, the astonishing crash in wild fish species from tuna to sturgeon. Technology has made the problem worse, not better. For example, the increasing demand for fish first caused the advent of refrigerated boats that could stay at sea longer, then the use of radar and sonar to precisely locate schools of fish, then the use of 10-mile-long drift nets that caught all marine life on an industrial scale. As a result, most wild fish stocks have gone into precipitous decline. In other words, technology serves the goals that society gives it. If society's goal is to catch more fish, technology will do so, even unto extinction. So while technology may be part of a solution to the challenge of a sustainable planet, it cannot function as the be-all and end-all of such an effort. Let's note again, technology will serve, for good or ill, whatever objectives that society implicitly or explicitly gives it. Another aspect of technology worth noting is that it frequently creates a new problem for every one that it solves. I'll just mention two examples. The invention of the automobile brought a new kind of freedom, but also, as an unintended consequence, it brought dramatically increased pollution and intense urban traffic jams. A second example out of many that could be mentioned is the discovery of the structure of the atom, which brought a new understanding of the physical world, but also resulted in the ongoing threat of catastrophic nuclear war. The second of these myths is the free market. A study of history would normally incline one to favor free markets. The history of centrally planned economies is generally a dismal one. Free markets tend to allocate investment capital with great efficiency, thus being powerful generators of societal abundance. But free markets must be overseen and regulated by society for at least two reasons. First, markets are not per se interested in society's good. Money, capital, tends to be amoral. Not immoral exactly, just amoral. For the most part, capital simply seeks the highest return it can obtain while minimizing risk. In a certain sense, this is just the rational thing to do. However, it means that very cold calculation is sometimes employed. As a Japanese journalist commented, if capital can obtain a 15% annual return for 10 years by fishing a species to extinction and a 10% return by fishing sustainably, it will often choose the 15% return, fish the species to extinction, and then look for some other species to hunt. Second, markets are inherently oriented to the short term. Take the oil market, for example. There are many factors that might affect the price of oil 10 or 20 years from now, but the price discovery mechanism of the global oil markets don't care about any of that. The worldwide price of oil at any given moment is determined by the marginal supply and demand for oil at that moment. Since markets don't look long-term, if a global society is to reach sustainability, then its free markets must be placed in a long-term context. As one example, a substantial carbon tax applied throughout the world's economy would tend to automatically incorporate a long-term perspective on the climate and the ecology into global oil and other energy markets, even though those markets are still operating freely and short-term. Thus, while technology and free markets can be powerful allies in reaching planetary goals of sustainability, they can only be a part of the solution and must be made to incorporate humanity's long-term goals into their activities. Now let's look at some spiritual and cultural principles by which a sustainable planet might function. It's fine to say that we should all buy hybrids, purchase locally, compost, recycle, and so forth. But such laundry lists of solutions, while certainly valuable, cannot in and of themselves solve our planetary crisis, it seems to me, because they do not affect the fundamental paradigms within which we are operating. Perhaps we need something more general, principles which each person, each corporation, each government, each non-governmental organization can use in formulating their own personalized set of solutions, principles which can be used to assist in navigating through the minefield that almost certainly lies ahead. Let's imagine if we traveled through the galaxy and came across a planet inhabited by intelligent beings who had managed to create a truly sustainable world. What spiritual and cultural principles might they be operating by? Principle number 1, it seems to me, would be love of reality. Love of reality, in my opinion, has to be the first principle because without it, nothing lasting will really be accomplished. It's possible, there are people who have done it, it is possible to fall in love just as you would fall in love with someone romantically, except more so. It is possible to fall in love with the whole world just as it is. That just as it is the key part. Notice, and we can all relate to this, our minds want to fall in love partially, like, I'll love this but not that, or I'll love him but not her, or I'll love this group but not that group, or I'll love reality except that people shouldn't lie, or I'll love reality except there shouldn't be war, or whatever. Now the fact is, war does exist. People do lie sometimes. If we say that those things shouldn't exist, or that we'll love everything except for this part or that person, we're not truly loving reality yet. If we're carving out exceptions, then we're not truly loving this world as it is yet. But here's a question. Why should we want to? Isn't this just advocating solving the world's problems by singing Kumbaya around the campfire? I know. I may be the most naive person on the planet right now. But I also think there may be the core of something here that's relevant and valuable, so I'm giving it a voice. Bear with me, if you will. Here's how it works. The mind can be doing its usual tricks, saying, I like this person, but I don't like that person, or whatever. But underneath all that, underneath all those likes and dislikes, underneath all those beliefs about what should and shouldn't be, there's something deep within each of us that just loves it all, that doesn't make any exceptions, that is in love just as you would be with the love of your life, but with everything. That is in love with all things and all people and all situations just as they are. And that kind of love, in my opinion, is going to be essential if humanity is going to create a sustainable world, because only from a deep love of reality as it is can come a deep love of the planet and of humanity and of all life on the planet. And only from that can come the kind of action that arises from deep love and not just from a sense of ought or should. It's that kind of deep in-loveness which already exists within each of us when we're not busy listening to our mental chatter and beliefs. It's that kind of deep in-loveness that is transformative, that can actually lift the planet to something that can exist forever. This doesn't mean that we condone hurtful things. It doesn't mean that we condone rape, murder, war, or any hurtful act. But it means that underneath, we're not making any exceptions to our love of reality as it is. It means that underneath, we accept the divine wisdom that reality embodies. Jesus said something one time, and I'm loosely paraphrasing here, but it went something like this. If we love only those who love us, what have we accomplished? That's what everybody does. It's when we can love the unacceptable parts of reality that our hearts really open. And from there, our actions, whatever they are, will have an appropriateness and a deep, wise effectiveness that can only come from love. So that's principle number 1 of a sustainable planet. Each of us brings forth that in us which loves all things and all life and all situations as glimpses of the divine handiwork that lies behind and within everything. And then we let action arise from that. We might call it a kind of divine passion. Principle number 2, it seems to me, is a long-term vision of a sustainable planet. As each of us knows in one form or another, everything worthwhile begins with a vision. It's the vision that helps to sustain us as we go through difficulties and obstacles. It's the vision that keeps us pointed towards what can seem almost unobtainable. It's the vision for our planet that will be the embodiment of that divine love which is in each of us. If we want to create a sustainable planet, each of us, all of us, must maintain a vision that a sustainable planet is possible and that we have a role to play in getting there. But isn't this a contradiction? If we love everything just as it is, then how can we work for something that doesn't exist, that isn't here yet? I agree, it's logically inconsistent. To the mind, it looks like this. If we loved everything as it is, then we'd just sit on the couch all day and drool. But that's not how it actually works. Rather, at a deep level, we perceive the perfection that represents the divine energy in every aspect of reality, and yet we can also play our part in creating a sustainable planet. We see the perfection of the seed, but we also see the perfection in watering and nurturing that seed. In effect, the seed goes from one perfection to the next perfection. So we hold a vision that Earth can be a sustainable planet while being in love with every aspect of reality as it is right now. From the perfection of the seed now to the perfection it will be then. The mind has difficulty with this, but the heart can understand. Part of this vision is that it's long-term. It's a vision of the end result, a sustainable planet, as difficult as that might seem right now. It's not about short-term expediency. Oftentimes our human actions towards the natural world, not to mention each other, have been geared to the expedient and the short-term, to the question of how can we get what we want most rapidly. But this planetary vision poses a different and deeper kind of question. How will this action of mine affect the Earth and all life on it, years or decades or even centuries from now? Looking far down the road may seem wildly unrealistic at the moment, when we have all these pressing issues and challenges. But I believe such far-sightedness will become commonplace if we truly do succeed in creating a sustainable world. Principle number 3, it seems to me, is looking to causes rather than symptoms. Right now there are various schemes being contemplated which would counteract the symptoms of, for example, global warming, without actually getting at the causes. These schemes involve such things as positioning giant mirrors in space to deflect part of the sun's rays from Earth, or seeding the oceans with iron to stimulate phytoplankton growth and thus remove more carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis. A serious objection to such schemes is that they focus on the symptom, in this instance global warming, instead of the cause, emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Applying such superficial remedies would allow us to continue to emit increasing amounts of carbon, thus making the problem worse long term. It would be like stepping on the accelerator and the brake at the same time. The ultimate result could be disastrous if such efforts ever fail or prove to be misguided. The unintended consequences of such schemes would, by definition, be unknowable right now. But almost certainly there would be unintended consequences, the effects of which could be extremely severe. This is not to be against technology. There is no going back. We are immersed in technology, and we have far too many people to exist without it. But let's direct our technology to serve a deep connection to and humility for the natural world by focusing, for example, on the development of renewable energy rather than extracting every last drop of non-renewable fossil fuel from the earth. If we really do desire a sustainable planet, it seems probable that we'll need to approach our situation in the most fundamental way. That is, by getting in touch with our deep embeddedness in and dependence on nature and letting our solutions come out of that consciousness. Principle number 4 is a steady state population and economy. This was one of the other 2 out of 3 pillars that Tokugawa Japan dealt with. About 60,000 years ago, perhaps 10,000 humans existed on planet Earth. Now, our population is 700,000 times that. 7 billion people, on our way to 9 billion by 2050. If we want to see how important population is, just imagine if the human population were 100 million now instead of 7 billion. Virtually all of our ecological problems would go away, at least until we got into the multiple billions again. It is the relentless growth of human population that feeds all other ecological challenges, from deforestation to resource depletion to dangerous levels of pollution. In most of the developed world, the birth rate is actually below 2.1 per couple, the sustainable rate. But in much of the developing world, the birth rate is still much higher. Thus, human population is forecast to keep on increasing. I don't have any pat answers here, but I will note that in every country where increased education and contraception has been made available to women, the birth rate has fallen. This seems to be one of those areas where a modest investment could have huge returns. The third pillar that Tokugawa Japan addressed, and that must be addressed on Earth at a global level, is the idea of a steady-state economy. It's currently taken for granted that growth, endless economic growth, is a good thing. Every politician is in favor of it. Virtually all think tanks are in favor of it. It's such a fundamental part of our current human paradigm that we don't even question it. Indeed, the whole global economy is built on the idea. It's that rare thing on which both liberals and conservatives readily agree. We even have other names for it, like progress. Not striving for growth seems literally unthinkable. Yet world economic activity has been increasing during the last century at an average rate of 3%. Sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but that's the average, 3%. But here's an interesting fact. At a 3% growth rate, everything doubles in 24 years and quadruples in 48 years. What that means is this. If economic growth continues at an average rate of just 3%, energy use, resource use, and pollution emissions would all quadruple in just 48 years. Given that we're already at 50% overshoot, that would make a sustainable planet virtually impossible. Indeed, it would lead to greater and greater overshoot until, like the sports car over the red line, society collapses. So this unthinkable idea must be grappled with. How can we create a society that is able to preserve an element of dynamism while the overall economy is in a steady state? I don't have an answer, but I note that Tokugawa Japan addressed the issue by going back to spiritual principles and questioning the idea that happiness came from more and more and more. Instead, the values of prudence and moderation in all affairs took hold in society. It worked then. Indeed, it was vital to the solution. Perhaps it could work again, especially if addressed from the spiritual perspective that true happiness comes from within. That real happiness is an inside job, not an outside one. So it appears that we must address the so-called growth imperative, and one thing to keep in mind is that there is no limit on growth in culture, creativity, innovation, spirituality, compassion, and so forth. Principle number 5 is meeting Herman Daly's 3 conditions. It was back in 1973 that Daly proposed 3 conditions for a sustainable planet. They were, first, the rate of use of renewable resources must be below the rate at which they are being regenerated. This is common sense. If a resource is renewable, it must be renewing at a rate higher than it's being depleted. Second, the rate of use of non-renewable resources must be below the rate at which renewable substitutes are being found and brought on stream. So if a resource is non-renewable, renewable substitutes must be found faster than the non-renewable resource is being depleted. Third, the rate of pollution emissions must be below the rate at which the biosphere can sustainably detoxify them without damaging the detoxifying and recycling elements of the biosphere. I won't dwell on Daly's 3 conditions because just a modicum of reflection reveals that a sustainable planet cannot be created without them. However, this much can be noted. Implementing these 3 conditions will probably require that humanity achieve the closed loops so prevalent in nature. What does that mean, closed loops? It means that in nature, the output of every process is the input of some other process. So there is no such thing as waste in nature because all loops are closed. It would appear that humanity will need to achieve something like that. Another observation about Daly's 3 conditions. Let's ask, what is the single most impactful thing that a person can do to benefit the ecology of the earth? The answer may surprise you. It's to become a vegan. Consider this. It takes 15 times as much land, 20 times as much energy, and 200 times as much water to produce a pound of beef as to produce a pound of wheat. In other words, a vegan uses dramatically less land, energy, and water than a meat eater. However we might feel about that, it's something to ponder when we consider how to personally make the greatest difference to the planet as we go about our daily life. A final observation about Daly's 3 conditions is that the planet will need to be at peace. Of necessity, a sustainable global society would be making intelligent use of its limited resources, and military use of resources is not intelligent. Bullets, bombs, rockets, and so forth waste the capital, labor, and resources that went into them. But how to achieve peace on Earth? I don't have an answer to that either, except to note that not only does peace increase sustainability, but it might work the other way around as well. With each increase in sustainability, there might also be a greater ability to envision and achieve a peaceful world, since the final goal of a perpetually sustainable world probably cannot be achieved without it. In closing, I'd like to return to the first principle. In creating a sustainable world, perhaps the most important thing of all is to perceive that our divisions are illusory, that we are one. Who is this we? Everything, everybody, with nobody and nothing left out. In reality, we are one thing, one essence, one spirit. Ultimately, we are not black, brown, white or yellow, woman or man, Christian or Hindu, Western or Eastern, or any other distinction. Yes, we are those things, but we're also something deeper. We are all human beings together. In my opinion, the planet will start becoming truly sustainable when human beings perceive themselves first and foremost not as belonging to this nation or that tribe or this race or that belief, but as belonging to humanity. First, foremost, identifying ourselves as human beings, brothers and sisters to all other human beings. When we're inclusive enough to embrace all of humanity within our identification, we also begin to perceive that our identification can be widened even further to include the mysteries and splendors of nature. It's not so much that we join nature as that we rejoin her, as in the days before the various alienating revolutions, only now from a wiser, more experienced place. Quite apart from any scientific evidence for the Gaia notion, the idea that Earth is a living organism, in some way it can be sensed, felt, understood. This Earth, this Gaia, This global biosphere can be sensed as an integrated living intelligence, and its intelligence is much deeper than ours, for it has the wisdom of being older and more natural. It's amazing to study the integrated living cycles of the earth, the way everything contributes to everything else, the way that rhythms of all kinds feed into each other, the ineffable living network that maintains this planet, that is, itself, as a living, breathing organism. The heart knows that we and nature are not separate, but one thing. Of course, it's an illusion to think that we could exist separately from nature. When our mind is clear and open, we come into our birthright, which is to perceive ourselves as an organic part of the living intelligence that is nature, and even more, as an organic part of the infinite intelligence that is behind and within all things. To truly create a sustainable planet, we'll need a great love affair, a great falling in love with our humanity, with the natural world, and ultimately with all of reality just as it is. In a sustainable world, each of us would know that we are one, that we're not separate, not from the natural world, not from each other, not from the infinite living intelligence. The earth is already in many ways an exquisite garden, and someday it will be even more exquisite, a garden where we live in synthesis with nature and each other and all of life, and where our true love affair is with existence just as it is, greeting us in every face and every sunset and every situation as our very own self, our own heart. Joseph Campbell said this about it: "Where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. Where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world." This presentation copyright 2014 by James M. Sloman, all rights reserved.